Today on Locked On Suns, nobody on the 2023-24 Phoenix Suns had to adjust more, had to deal with more, and eventually dealt with more ire from the Suns fan base than Bradley Beal. Can he bounce back? And how might that look under Coach Mike Budenholzer and hopefully a new look Suns roster? We'll break it down today. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Brendon Kleen, your host, credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 7 seasons and the host of the Just Basketball Show. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen to kick off your Friday. Welcome to the show. If you haven't already, hit follow or subscribe wherever you're finding us. We're free and available everywhere, including YouTube. When you hit that button, you get a new episode in your feed every single Monday through Friday. Become an everydayer right here. Get locked onto the Phoenix Suns all off season long, where there is sure to be some madness. I just saw Shams Charania report that the Suns are actually interested in Bronny James. So we're not talking about that today, but, you know, We're just in the middle of all the shenanigans. Joining us as he does every single Friday to wrap up the week is Stephen PridGeon. He is a writer over at Bright Side of the Sun. He is a podcaster over at PHNX. And today's episode, guys, before we get into it, brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. All right, Stephen. So Bradley Beal, part of why I was waiting to do this episode with you is I think heading into the season, before you were on every week, we talked about Beal when you just came on as a guest, and I feel like that might be one of the things about this team we disagree about the most, is did he have to adjust? What was his role going to look like? None of us really knew, but I felt like you and I were somewhat far apart. His season ended up being very rocky. He finishes with 18, 5, and 4 per game, becomes this team's lead perimeter defender on top of being a scorer, and of course flames out in that game 4, fouling out, shooting the ball like crap. And I think Suns fans are looking at him quite a bit here as we head toward an off season, a training camp, and another season for this Big Three to try to figure it out. So when I just ask you now, having seen 53 games of it and a whole year of this, what is Bradley Beal's ideal role within the structure of, at the very least, what we know this Big Three will look like on the court heading into next season? What's going to get the most out of him? What should it look like?
I think, for one, it should be him initiating offense in a little bit more of a balanced variety with Devin Booker in particular. Almost closer to 50-50 in my opinion. Gives the offense 2 different flavors from the inception point. Bradley Beal is going to push the pace a little bit more. He's going to get you in the movement from that inflection point with more consistency, whereas Devin Booker is more than likely to be a little bit more pick and roll than movement going into a next action. So I think there's a difference there that can be positive in contrast for the team looking at their general offensive process. And then in addition to initiating offense a little bit more, I also think Bradley Beal being a piece that you use to move around the chessboard consistently in terms of running him off of stagger screens, running him off of a variation of wide pin downs or middle pin downs, not unlike Mike Budenholzer saw with his usage of Chris Middleton, who was notorious for those middle pin downs, getting those touches around the elbow or nail, working in isolation or going into a mid-range pick and roll from there. I think that's the best template in terms of usage for him. When we did see him used in those ways, it was quite effective. A lot of empty DHO action with Nurkic, where he's working and read and react off of the leverage that the defenders defending him with. If he's top blocking, which they usually would like to do, the back door is wide open because of Nurkic pulling the X5 or opposing center away from the basket. And if they decide to play him in lock and trail, comes off of the DHOs, and his tempo and cadence either pulls over help from the nail, or he's able to garner the attention of that big and he can hit Nurkic and get in the playmaking from there. So I think those are the best ways to use him on offense. But I'm curious where your mind is on that after seeing him this season and just kind of generally what you think about it.
Yeah, well, I agree. It's the basic premise of what you said, and I can already again, we're gonna get the comment of please put video on the screen or terminology. Look, we don't have mind the game level production, guys. Stephen will circle back on the definitions as we need to, but we saw some of it, and I think I continue to wonder about Nurkic's role in this team, and not only if he'll be on it from a salary matching, just salary cap, how this stuff has to look standpoint, but if he's going to fit in what this new version of the team looks like. But even if it's not him, a lot of the dribble handoff and manipulating of the defense types of things that you're talking about there, that was what I was pulling my hair out about the most this season. Is why did we not see the best three players on this team working together on offense enough? I don't have a great answer for that. Obviously, it happened at times, but I'm not just talking about one guy passing it to the other. I'm talking about making the defense have to react to at least two of those players at one time, regardless of how that even ends up happening. And that's part of why I'm optimistic about Bud. And I know Suns fans I might sound like a hypocrite there, because I was, and I know you were, kind of a champion of Nurk, so to speak, just because he was the guy that most consistently could get them to run offense and actually manipulate the defense at all. I would just like to see, maybe if Nurk's not on the team, or even if he is, okay, great, he did that, but if he's not one of the best players, can you get Durant to do that more often? Can you get Booker to do that more often within the confines of this team? And I even looked to Washington last year, well, now 2 years ago, and I've said this 100 times, I feel like, on the show, but it's still true. They seem to do that better with Porzingis and Kuzma as Beal's co-pilots than the Suns did with two future Hall of Famers in Booker and Durant doing that. And maybe Booker, future Hall of Famers, a little ahead of ourselves, but whatever. Those guys are better than Porzingis and Kuzma, and yet it felt more sticky and more awkward, and I don't really understand that. So that feels like easy, low-hanging fruit to me. I think the obvious other one that I want to hit is just another thing that I would imagine Bud will help with here, Stephen, is we're all broken records, but it is what it is. Beal is number one to me on the list of guys who can and should be taking more three-pointers. At his peak, he was taking 7-8 a game, and that was even with, in his prime, when he's making all-star games post John Wall. This is not me asking him to do something he did when he was a kid. He did it at his peak and to great results. So he just has to have that quicker trigger and let it fly. And I could see a lot of those things working hand in hand, where he's coming off screens, he's working off ball, he's starting a possession on the ball, and then, spacing or doing some of that from there and getting it back, and him scoring, him being aggressive doesn't have to be one or the other with the shooting. And I think both of those have to happen for him to get back into the 20s per game and just be more of a threat out there and make this offense harder to guard.
Yep, I think you set that on the tee and you knocked that out the park. His especially that latter end, the shot profile for Bradley Beal in particular is extremely important. And I feel like that's pertaining to Beal, that's probably the outside of the movement stuff. That's the biggest thing that I was hammering home and emphasizing on Twitter as well as with my writing. And that's just the fact that, for one, like you said, following that game, I think it was late December, early January, if I'm not mistaken, against the Lakers, where he knocked down 7 or 8 threes, and immediately in postgame with Chris Haynes, he talked about, my coaches were on my butt about me getting up 3-point opportunities. They said that the chances are there. I just got to mentally approach it the right way. And from that point on, he was certainly better, but they need that on a lot more consistency, especially with the amount of catch and shoot opportunities that the big three are able to generate. And I think another point that you made, before I get to that one, the other big thing for me with Bradley Beal, talking about his shot profile, were the drives for him. So you got the 3-point shooting, and then you got the drives. He is looking at the offense and looking at the roster as a whole. By far the best driver of the basketball on the team is Bradley Beal. He averaged 12 drives a game this season, and stemming from his drives, the Suns shot 53.1%. and they scored on 52 and almost 52.5% of the times that he actually drove the basketball. So those numbers are good. I would like to see that number of 12 be a lot closer to 15, a lot closer to 18, because he is that elite level driver. No one can stay in front of him for more than 2 dribbles. Most people can't stay in front of him for more than 1, especially if he's getting it off of movement. And I think that's where the blending of his usage within the offense really starts to have a little bit more impact. And then the other thing I was going to transition to outside of his individual shot profile, you mentioned the fact that you would like to see the big 3 used in action as a trio, and then having 2 other players spaced. I'm thinking about those moments that we talked about really on the last 2 episodes that we were on the last 2 weeks with Bud. And one of the things that we both are looking forward to most with him, the creativity that he brings to the offensive side of the ball. I think there were certainly pockets where, and I certainly highlighted them on Twitter, where we saw Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, and Bradley Beal on an empty side in a 3-player action where they're getting into their dribble handoff variations with those 3 players. That's naturally forcing switches. And now one of those 2 players, especially if it's Kevin Durant that gets a switch, can now just walk his man into the post, and you get to that action with 16 seconds left on the shot clock. Durant gets the switch. They're going to send a double, and now you got the dominoes falling from the defense, and now you're able to generate those catch-and-shoot 3-point opportunities that are of the highest value for this Phoenix Suns team. I think they left a ton of food on the table in terms of that particular realm of their process on offense, and I also feel like that's something that Bradley Beal can be spearheaded. And I also think it's something that Mike Budenholzer is going to enable even more so, because we saw that quite consistently with his big 3 in Milwaukee in that championship season. That was a staple for them in crunch time play.
Yeah, just to give some of the numbers before we transition to role and personnel aside from the big 3 a little more, he did take more threes this year than he had since the COVID-shortened the year the Suns made the finals, 2021 season, but barely. And his rim attempts went a little bit down, and I think how he gets them, to your point, is also important there, the drives and everything else. His low center of gravity, his ability to stop and start, that I could see him doing a lot of the things that we're seeing, the moves and the taking advantage of space that we're seeing guys like Jaylen Brown or Anthony Edwards do. We've seen him do it before. I think his skill set should be flourishing in a system like this, on a roster like this, but he just has to kind of get back to, I think, what made him special. But let's talk about the other thing I was going to say, his free throw rate went way down. That was part of what I was going to bring up there, and that goes hand in hand with a lot of this. Get inside, attack mismatches, attack pockets more aggressively, and those easier points will come too. It really kind of fell off a cliff. It was his worst since his second season in terms of how many free throws he took compared to field goals. So let's talk about where those pockets might come and what it might look like next year. We don't know what the Suns will do, but again, we know the coach and we know some of what their needs are heading into the offseason. So we'll get into how that could morph it all coming up next. First, today's show brought to you by Prize Picks, the best place to play daily fantasy sports, my favorite place to play daily fantasy sports. April is behind us, but the NBA playoffs are continuing. Get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during basketball's postseason. Turn $10 into $1,000, winning up to 100 times your money with as few as 4 correct picks on Prize Picks. It's that easy. It's that simple. Basketball, hockey, and beyond, all on Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. You can mix and match your lineups, meaning you could combine, let's say, Luka in the finals with Caitlin Clark in the regular season, and maybe a little bit of whoever's left in the NHL playoffs, which I'm not going to pretend to know. That's your lineup. It doesn't have to be all in one sport, and you just say more or less on a specific stat. Points, rebounds, assists in basketball, goals in hockey, whatever you are feeling in that particular matchup. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types all make Prize Picks the #1 fantasy sports app. Download it today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's the Prize Picks app or prizepicks.com. Promo code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, Stephen. So let's just address this talking point that I see out there, and it was out there during the regular season, but I think it's picking up steam as Suns fans look about at maybe a point guard or wing depth or any of the non-center needs that I think we can all agree this roster has. This idea of bringing Bradley Beal off the bench. I've always approached it from the standpoint of like, just get real. Like this is an all-NBA player. This is a number 3 overall pick, a guy who has represented his country and makes a max salary. We can dream whatever we want to dream, but that's not happening. But from a basketball standpoint, I think to drill down a little bit better, why do you still have optimism that Beal can be part of the solution to what went wrong for the Suns on the court last year, and not somebody who has to be kind of mitigated in order to improve the team? Because I feel like that's what Suns fans think is, well, he didn't cut it. Let's bring in a different guy. Less of Beal is the pathway to a better team. Why is that not the case?
It's not the case because I just don't feel that the big three were optimized in terms of how they're used on the court when they were sharing time on the floor together. And the beauty of having 3 top-tier players like this is that you should be able to stagger them in multiple variations, whether it's one of those 3 on the floor and the offense takes on a complete different look, or 2 of those 3 and the offense takes on a different look than when all 3 on the floor. And you should be able to pull out the strings of your defense, of the opposing defense, in multiple ways to where they can't catch up to figuring out and solving the riddle that is your big 3 when they need to most. That's something that should be a dictating point for this team, regardless of who the opponent is. You spend that much money and you spend that much capital to facilitate to your coach this roster that you have for that exact reason. And the fact that they saw the struggles that they did last season, especially with the spacing and the pieces in complementary fashion that they had around them, it just speaks to those 3 in particular not being optimized in their usage together. It lends itself to a little bit of the stuff that we talked about in the last segment. It also lends itself to, in particular, you talked about the Bradley Beal free throw attempts, only 2.5 a game. He shot, I think he had 15 games, if I'm not mistaken, of the 53 that you said he played last season, where he didn't attempt a single free throw. And you can take one game away that he exited early, but even with that game included, that's 28% of the games that he was available for you where he didn't attempt not one single free throw. That's partly on him, but that's also the usage of him and how he's being featured. You have to optimize those big 3 before you do anything else with anyone else. And you kind of look at the Suns process as a whole. Outside of Kevin Durant, who else are they going to throw the ball into to invert offense? There was no one. Yusuf Nurkic gets a post touch, but it's to facilitate, it's not to score. So look at it from that perspective. The best way for them to invert offense, especially with the spacing that they do have, is to get paint touches from Bradley Beal first and foremost before anybody else. And when they're lacking that means they're being a lot more predictable in their process. Defenses can load up in the gaps, and we see some of the inconsistencies that we saw from this offense over the course of the regular season, especially even more so in the playoffs.
Yeah, that's all good stuff. I think we've covered that it can fit. And you and I have both been on the same page. We talked about it in previous weeks that bringing in a playmaker, a ball handler, I don't think anyone would say no to that, you know. I think it's about who that is and how they fit within the context of the rest of the roster. I want to flip to the defensive end, and then we'll go into more specifics on, I have some like rapid fire personnel stuff to throw at you to close the show, but defensively, I do think they're in a unique situation because turning him into their point of attack defender, at the end of the day, his size is always going to lend itself to that being one of the best ways you can deploy him. And he held up decently well. Now, when it's Anthony Edwards and it's a playoff situation and teams are scheming consistently to try to break you down, I think it went less well. He probably shouldn't be put into a position of being the only effective point of attack guy for this team next year. Talk about needs. But because he's not very big, because he's maybe not a switchable player and all these other limitations just because of his size and, maybe trying to protect him from injury a little bit too, there is, I think, an understandable tendency to say, well, he kind of has to guard the lead small guy on the opposing team. And I think that goes back to a lot of why you and I kept saying that putting more size around that makes more sense. You can only have so many guys on the court where that's your answer, right? If that's kind of the same thing you would say about Grayson Allen, you don't really want him to be off the ball too much because he's not going to be able to make an impact. You're going to feel really small out there. Oh, and also Devin Booker kind of has to be put off in the corner because he can be exploited and he's not super big either. You're just running into problems regardless of what Beal's doing. So what do you think of his defense with all that said? Because it is a little bit of a paradox there. It's like, well, that's what he's best at, but he's not great at it. So what do you do?
Yeah, there is a bit of a paradox there. My biggest thing with Bradley Beal, just off of watching his film and just watching him generally over his career, when he's engaged, he can be an extremely active and impactful defender in rotation. So you imagine him off the ball. You imagine you have that player that you feel comfortable with size at the point of attack. And Bradley Beal is one of those players on the weak side of an empty corner action. He's able to make those close and recover and contain the ball type of scenarios, run three-point shooters off the line, arrive there on the catch like most coaches want from their defense, and be able to contain the ball, keep your defensive shell intact. He's also, again, when engaged, a player that's good with showing help in the gaps. He has solid hands. For his stature being a little bit shorter than you would like, his wingspan is very good. It's a plus. And that's something that enables him to get those jab or stun and recover scenario type of steals, dislodging of the ball when somebody's driving into a gap that he's responsible for. I think you lose some of that value when you have to consistently put him on the ball. And again, he's also a player that can be average on the ball in terms of point of attack defense and just guarding his yard. The issues start to come in when you're asking him to navigate 50 ball screens a game and guard Anthony Edwards in isolation for 15 possessions a game. That's not his cup of tea. That's not what he's built to do. It's something he can do, but it's not something that he should be forced to fit into as a role on consistency on a game-by-game basis. That speaks to a flawed roster in terms of the construct. Now, if you get somebody, I'm not going to say it's Royce O'Neal directly, but if you get somebody to fill a role similarly to how Royce O'Neal can and showed that he can when he was featured with that starting lineup, now you see Devin Booker, who can be a stout help defender with his subtle moments in rim protection secondarily and little things like that. And like I just talked about with Bradley Beal as a rotation defender, now you have those pieces in position in addition to Kevin Durant being off the ball to where everybody's close to their optimized version of themselves within your defensive scheme. Sure. And now you can expect more consistency because you are facilitating to their strengths and their weaknesses based off of your roster construct. That's why I feel like they have to knock this ancillary piece of adding a bigger wing or two that can facilitate to point of attack and wing defense to help just reorganize the pecking order and be able to keep things a lot more in alignment and play to the strengths of their big three, not just on the offensive side of the ball, but also on defense.
Yeah, execution goes a long way, I think, with all of this, and the breakdowns and the problems we might have all felt like were happening with the Suns' defense, and they're too stretched out, and this and that. It's like if everybody's just doing their job and there's less exposed space that's not supposed to be there because of mistakes and miscommunication and mental lapses and all that stuff, then I think you're able to identify needs a little bit easier, and you're also just able to have less fluctuation. So I think that's why a coaching change, personnel improvements can help there. But at the end of the day, I do worry they're just up against it in terms of being too small, unless they can really find somebody to plug in there next to the big three, plus a center who's ideally at least as big, if not bigger, than Allen and Booker, both from a height standpoint, but also a sturdiness and weight standpoint. So let's get to personnel, maybe discuss some of those options and what that could look like coming up right after this. All right, let's close out the show. I'm going to throw A few questions your way, Stephen, about this roster and what they're looking at here in the context of kind of Beal and maximizing the big three. I guess a first one is, do you think they'll be able to find anybody that you would trust more than Royce O'Neal to fill in there? And knowing that Bud prioritizes size, I think he's probably more likely, and with the reset of a season and less, disrespect, so to speak, of benching Allen, should we just be thinking of Royce O'Neal as the fifth starter for this team as we're talking through all this stuff?
Yeah, for all of the reasons that we spoke to, I think so. Just because it's going to be hard to navigate the second tax apron stipulations, and if you can offload some of your bigger contracts, what are you getting in return? Is it going to be something that appeases to that particular weakness? That's a lot of ambiguity in addition to, like you said, addressing the center position. So I think we have to look at things through the lens of Royce O'Neal being that piece. I do feel like he can help. I just don't feel like, again, he's not even being optimized because he can't be the sole piece that you're relying on to facilitate all of these different things. Again, he's good as an in addition, so he can't be your default end-all be-all. We need one stop. We're going to put Royce O'Neal on Anthony Edwards to win this game for us on defense. We need one stop. We're putting Royce O'Neal on LeBron James to get this stop for us. Like, he can get it done. He's showing that he can, but he's not supposed to be your feature number one defender. That can't be it. And that person that is in that position should be good enough to where you're not even contemplating putting Kevin Durant there either. But I'm curious, what do you think about that question? Because that's a good one, and it's something that they have to answer if they want to take a step, getting closer to that contending, which they certainly desire to do.
I just think about how Bud played, and there's this, I think, a little bit of a misconception that because he is this guy that's kind of known for size and everything, that they always played really big, which they didn't. And I was remembering going back, I don't even know how I ended up here, but remembering the season, I guess it would have been after they won the championship. Brook Lopez missed like more than half the year. I had completely forgotten that happened, and they didn't really bring in some other difference-making center, partially because they didn't have the flexibility to do that, but they just played Giannis and Portis, and they had a little bit of Ibaka. They had Sandro Mamukelashvili, who I think could make sense here. He's on the Spurs now, but he started out there. He played a bit, but they went small, and they still figured it out. Their defense obviously took a little bit of a hit, but Bud can execute those principles with positional size, even if he doesn't have a traditional center. I just worry that while that might be true, the idea of X center, whoever that might be, whether it's Nurk or somebody else, in a drop, aggressive help, even with the value that Durant can have in a system that's firing on all cylinders, and I do think he's somebody that, whether we like it or not, his effort is going to be higher when he feels trust in his teammates, and you got to earn that. Even if all of that works, a bunch of 6'4", 6'5" guys in that situation, I just don't like as much as what Bud was often working with, where the smallest dude on the court, even if Brook wasn't out there, was Drew Holiday, who's, the most upward, positional, can guard up of maybe anybody in the entire NBA. That was his smallest, most what do we do with him piece a lot of times in some of those lineups. That's a hard problem to solve for. So I would tend to say just put as much size out there as you possibly can and hope that your team structure kind of gets the job done. Maybe you switch a little more than, well, they were switching quite a bit by the end of the season last year in Phoenix, but maybe you keep doing that and you seed some initial, penetration and rotation, but you just trust that you're going to contest and recover and kind of take away the paint through the course of that better than you did last year. And I think the ceiling on the on the opposing in order to get there, but feel free to jump off that if you want. But the other question I had to personnel-wise is just if you could think of a center, even if it's not a specific player. I know, you brought up Al Horford on our last episode. There's free agent names out there. I don't know how familiar you are with the draft guys. I'm not super familiar myself, but what type of center would you want to be playing 30-plus minutes a night for this team in terms of what they do on the court, what their strengths are as a player to maximize everything we're talking about?
I think as archetypes, having an athletic center that can provide vertical spacing on offense and rim protection on defense is certainly something that can help. I think this team would greatly, I can't say greatly enough, benefit from having a center with scheme versatility to their defensive versatility, to unlock some hedge and recover type scenarios, to unlock some obviously switching, 5-out switching potentially in emergency situations, and generally as a template for the defense from the onset. Also, somebody that can be up to touch with great consistency, even if they are ultimately getting back into drop coverage. And, one of the names you talked about, Al Horford, is certainly somebody that could consistently do that. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things that have to take place for that to happen. So I'm not saying that it would happen. I'm just saying he's a template for a type of player that can certainly benefit from being with the Suns' context defensively, and that their defense can certainly benefit from having as well in turn. I think Robert Williams is another example of a type of player that has that type of scheme versatility, that has the type of size.
Yeah, I meant to bring him up. You wrote about him on Brightside this week. Yeah, if he's healthy, he's perfect.
Correct. And that's the key part of it, if he's healthy. But I think when you're pigeonholed with the situation that the Suns are in with the second tax apron and all of that stuff, you don't have really a choice to be picky. Beggars can't be choosers, and you would have to be begging for a team to even facilitate a trade with you to give you some cap relief and actually add to your roster talent-wise. So I think Robert Williams is about as good as they could do in terms of if they're stripping a player from someone else's roster. Another piece that I would like to see with this team, and it's going to come with some Shaq in a Fool type of situations that may come up, just tip my hand. Andre Drummond just had one hell of a season for the Chicago Bulls. Started a handful of games, but obviously, even more importantly, he played off of the bench as a reserve center. He's the type of piece that brings a physically imposing presence in the paint. He's a piece that has levels of scheme versatility that you don't necessarily think of. But if you actually look at the numbers, outside of him being, you heard it ad nauseum this season, the best defensive rebounder in NBA history off of percentage of rebounds that he grabs when he's on the floor, that stuff is dope. He closes possessions, but he has scheme versatility to him to where he can play drop coverage with consistency, but he can be up to touch with his drop coverage for almost the entire game. And he has the foot speed. He has the versatility in terms of being able to move laterally with his quickness. And he also has the hand speed to be able to get his hand in that passing lane and potentially even dislodge the dribble from whoever it is that's coming off of a screen. He's the type of player that can help behind somebody like Robert Williams. And he's consistent enough with health to where if you have to start him for 20, 25 games because Robert Williams is hurt and you undo your front court and insulate it with those two, that's something that you can work with. You can work to Bud's strengths as well. It can kind of help bridge the gap from what was to what is.
Yeah, I think I might have just phrased that question wrong because I think the reality is they're probably not going to get anybody who plays 30-plus minutes. I think because of their limitations and everything, and I think honestly probably what they would have preferred even this past season by getting by getting Eubanks, by getting Metu, and even like Bull or whatever was to not even have Nurkic have to do that, but if they can cobble together, and maybe Nurk stays around and he just has less to do and he's in a more limited role, that's probably what this is going to end up being like, because Robert Williams is not playing 40 minutes a night. That would be a malpractice. Al Horford is, too old to be doing that at this point if you want to keep him healthy. And, if you're drafting somebody at 22, which I think there's a lot of good options that fit some of the things you just said there, well, that guy's not going to play that much either. He's a rookie. So it's probably about having the options more so than it is, this is our guy, So we're out of time, but I do want to just highlight a player I talked about a little yesterday who you've been on another part of the rotation, which would just be DeLon Wright. It would be this. I said it yesterday. It would be this year's Eric Gordon. You'd have to really be convincing him that a role here and the value that he would have as a vet and a high minute player is worth his while above the money that he could get elsewhere. Because I think he'll have more than a minimum on the table from other teams if he's healthy. But the Suns can say, "You're our sixth man. What, are you going to get a better role anywhere else? Probably not. So come on over." And I think he would provide enough additional size he's basically as tall as Royce O'Neal. Here and everything as it pertains to Bradley Beal. So hopefully you enjoyed the week of shows. Hit follow or subscribe to get more next week. Become an everydayer here with Locked On Suns. Read Steven's work at Bright Side of the Sun and all the good stuff they do all off season long. We'll catch you guys next week.